and I was driving to the hospital to have emergency brain surgery. When I was 17, I noticed that the hearing in my left ear was noticeably different than that in my right. I mean, if I put a finger in my right ear, my left ear sounds like it's underwater. Now, as somebody gearing up to go to music school, this concerned me because I thought, am I losing my hearing already? So my mom took me to an ear doctor. They tested my hearing and they said, we can't really measure any hearing loss here. Whatever you're experiencing is probably just some genetic anomaly. I wouldn't worry about it. Just take precautions to protect your hearing as you usually do, and it's probably nothing. 10 years later, I'm getting really back into the saxophone and it's still there. So I go to the ear doctor again. They do a hearing test and they say, the difference we can measure in your hearing between your ears is so small that we can't even really call it hearing loss. So whatever it is, it's not something you have to be concerned about. So I wasn't and went about my life again. Another 5 years later, I start to notice my right ear feels the same as my left. Both of my ears now feel like I have my head underwater. A few Google searches tells me that it's probably just a wax buildup, so I tried a few over-the-counter remedies, which helped a bit but didn't improve it so much, so then I went to go see another ear doctor. He took a look inside, cleaned me out, and then my hearing in my right ear immediately went back to normal. And then since I was a new patient, he asked me if there was anything else about my hearing that he should know or that I wanted to ask him about. So I mentioned, well, the reason I came in is because my right ear was now starting to match my left ear, which was concerning. And I can remember having this issue in my ear since my late teens. So he looks inside and says, well, it's perfectly healthy. I can't see anything wrong there. But it is interesting that somebody at your age is complaining of hearing loss, so we should do an MRI just to see what's there. He said he thought it might be a benign tumor, which would just be a very small growth off of the auditory nerve, and you wouldn't do anything about it. It would just be interesting to see if we could pinpoint exactly what was causing this difference in perception of hearing. He orders the MRI, and I'm not thinking anything of it because I've lived this way for almost 20 years, and I eventually do get around to getting it maybe a month or two after this appointment. Within hours of getting the MRI, his office calls me and says, drop everything you're doing right now and go to the emergency room. At this point, you could say, I was freaking out, man. I figured they had found something that required immediate medical attention, and I was driving to the hospital to have emergency brain surgery. I was so affected by this, I initially drove to the wrong ER, and then when I finally got to the right one, I get there and they say, how can we help you? And I said, I don't know. I was just told to come here right away. And nobody had any information about it. So 5 hours and $800 later, the ER doctors eventually got a copy of my MRI, and they said, it looks like you have something called an acoustic neuroma. You're not in any danger. You can go home and you'll be fine, but you have to go talk to your doctor about this, and then speak to a qualified surgeon. This happens on a Friday, the weekend goes by, and on Monday I get a call from the ear doctor's office. And they said, hey, we're just calling to see if you managed to get to the emergency room on Friday. And I'm like, what do you mean did I manage to get there? You told me to drop what I was doing and go immediately. So, safe to say I had some questions. The next day I go to talk to the ear doctor and he shows me this image. And he says, okay, the good news is this is not cancer. Cancers are fast-growing masses, and nothing this big suddenly just appears in your head and you don't notice. So this has been here a very long time. Since you initially complained of hearing loss, this is probably an acoustic neuroma. The bad news is that it's compressing your brainstem to the point where it's almost completely closed off, which could lead to a condition called hydrocephalus, which can be fatal. But he said the bigger problem is that this is in the center of your head, meaning it was adjacent to some nerves that controlled very basic functions like swallowing and blinking. That because of this, one of the risks of the procedure, however low, is permanent facial paralysis on one side because the nerves are severely damaged in the process of removing this mass. He said there's a possibility of needing a feeding tube for life because your swallowing function no longer works. And then because your eyes can't lubricate, then you have to just be constantly applying eye drops because you can no longer blink. And even if there was a less than 5% chance of these things happening, the consequences of having to live with one of these side effects was pretty grave. And to add to this, he said that when the tumor is removed, it's nearly impossible to not irreparably damage the auditory nerve, because the tumor is an overgrowth of cells from that nerve. And oftentimes they just remove the auditory nerve altogether, which means a complete loss of hearing in that ear. So he said this really should be dealt with within the next 6 months and that I should expect to lose my hearing in my left ear. Regarding who should do the surgery, the ear doctor said, you really have to find a specialist of a specialist. It needs to be somebody who practically only does these kind of surgeries. Personally, if it were me, he said, there are 2 places in the world that I would trust to do this. Vanderbilt University, and then another place, I believe in Switzerland, he mentioned. I ended up doing the surgery at Vanderbilt, but I also had consultations at Johns Hopkins and NYU. And with every team of surgeons that I met, their first question was always the same. Who else are you talking to? Because this was so rare, they were all very concerned that I was talking only to the top-notch specialists in the field. The next thing they all said was also the same thing. They all said that if they had showed my MRI, and just my MRI, to their residents and said, now paint me a picture of this patient. What is his life like? What is he experiencing when he comes to see us? And they said the residents would all diagnose me as somebody who's having great difficulty to move, if he can even walk at all at this point, and he's not already in a wheelchair. And I had almost no symptoms. With all of the surgeons I spoke to, there was a sense of bewilderment because they were surprised that I could still walk. And just like my ear doctor, all of the surgeons said, when you wake up from the surgery, you should expect to be deaf in your left ear, which as a dedicated musician was profoundly upsetting. I joke that people often tell me I was so brave for going through this experience, but I can assure you, I was dragged kicking and screaming the entire time. After confirming that I was only talking to the best doctors, and then expressing their fascination that I could still walk, all the surgeons then said another thing that was unanimous, that I was going to survive this procedure, and that in the best case scenario, these surgeries are typically life-changing. There is typically always some new handicap you have to learn to live with. As far as hearing loss was concerned, that was considered an extremely minor and acceptable outcome. They were much more concerned with preserving my basic functions and avoiding facial paralysis as a consequence of the procedure. They all assured me that they would try their best to preserve my hearing, but realistically, don't even hope to keep it. They said there may be cases in the literature where that happens, but it's practically unheard of. So I should just accept that I'm only going to hear out of one ear for the rest of my life. All of them said that except one. Dr. Thompson took a look at my MRI scan and said, let me show you some other acoustic neuromas. And he showed me an image that looked like this and pointed out how on all of them, there is always this noticeable horn that comes off of the tumor. And that's where it is growing off of the auditory nerve. Hence the name auditory nerve schwannoma. But he said, with yours, it's missing this characteristic feature. So I don't know what it is, but I have a feeling that this is another kind of benign tumor that is not an acoustic neuroma. So even with a bit more hope to keep my hearing, I still went into the procedure expecting that I would wake up with only one functioning ear. Unlike the jaw surgery, which sounds pretty intense because they cut the bones of my mouth into like 6 or 7 pieces and then repositioned everything, this brain surgery was truly awful. In the months leading up to it, I was an absolute wreck because there was a chance that my life was effectively over. And then there was a chance, however small, that I was gonna suffer permanent disfigurement from this surgery and also loss of the ability of basic functions for living. So I found out about this brain tumor at the end of July, and I was on the operating table by October 3rd. And the months leading up to that were challenging, to say the least, because there was just a big question mark about what life was going to be like afterwards. The surgery itself lasted 11 and a half hours, and shockingly, I was only in the hospital for 3 days after that. For the first 2 days after the procedure, I couldn't walk, and then I had to use a walker for about 2 weeks while my balance came back. And then for probably about a month, I saw double vision. In the end, it turned out that what I had was a vagal nerve schwannoma, an overgrowth of Schwann cells on the vagus nerve. And thanks to the skill of the surgical team, I kept my hearing, and I don't hear any worse than I did before the procedure. I was back to normal in about 3 months, and it was like the entire thing had never happened. It's been over 2 years since this happened, and it practically feels like it happened to somebody else. As you might imagine, This whole experience has left me with a new perspective on life. I want to learn as much as I can about music and then share it with as many people as possible, and ultimately leave behind a meaningful contribution to music and music education. If you're wondering how I plan to do this moving forward, check out the last video in the series.